Hey there, friend. Welcome to this quiet corner of the night, where ancient stories unfold like worn parchment beneath candlelight. Tonight, we're not exploring grand temples or thundering chariots. We're walking a much quieter path, one that leads beyond the veil, into the shadowed realm where biblical souls found themselves after their final breath. Before we begin this gentle journey, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What city, what country, what time zone has brought you here to these ancient mysteries? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something beautifully comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the world, yet gathered here in this moment, sharing these timeless tales. If this kind of storytelling helps you drift towards sleep, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. We have many more stories waiting in the archives of time, each one ready to carry you gently into dreams. So settle in now, pull your blankets close, dim the lights, and let your breathing slow. Tonight, we descend not into mythology, but into the depths of biblical understanding, where death was not an ending, but a passage, and where the afterlife held mysteries that would shape faith for millennia to come. The ancient Hebrews did not fear death the way we might imagine. To them, death was as natural as the changing seasons, as inevitable as the sun setting behind the hills of Judea. But what came after, what lay beyond that final breath, was a question that echoed through every psalm, every prayer, every whispered conversation beside a dying loved one's bed. In the beginning, in those earliest biblical times, the afterlife was not a place of harps and clouds, not a realm of eternal singing or divine light streaming through pearl gates. No, it was something far more mysterious, far more human in its quiet simplicity. The dead, they believed, descended to a place called Sheol. Sheol. Even the word itself carries weight, doesn't it? It rolls off the tongue like a sigh, like the last breath leaving a body. In Hebrew, it meant simply the grave, but it was so much more than that. Sheol was the great gathering place, the silent realm beneath the earth, where all souls, righteous and wicked alike, found themselves after their earthly journey ended. Picture it now, if you will. Not a place of fire and brimstone, not a paradise of endless joy, but something in between. A vast, shadowy expanse where the dead existed in a state that was neither suffering nor bliss, but simply continuation. The ancient writers described it as a land of dust and darkness, where the mighty kings of old lay alongside the humble shepherds, where the wise and the foolish shared the same eternal rest. In Sheol, there was no hierarchy, no separation between the blessed and the cursed. Death, you see, was the great equalizer. The psalmist wrote of it as a place where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. It was not punishment, not reward, but a kind of cosmic pause, a holding place for souls who had completed their earthly chapters. The Hebrews understood something profound about death that we sometimes forget in our modern age. They knew that dying was not about individual judgment, not about personal salvation or damnation. It was about returning to the dust from which they came, about rejoining the great community of their ancestors who had walked this path before them. Abraham, when he died, was said to be gathered to his people. Isaac and Jacob the same. This wasn't merely poetic language. It reflected a deep belief that death was a homecoming of sorts, a return to the collective embrace of all who had gone before. In Sheol, the patriarchs waited, the prophets rested, the kings and paupers lay side by side in the democracy of death. But here's what made Sheol so different from later conceptions of the afterlife. The dead were not unconscious, not completely absent from existence, yet they were not fully alive either. They were like shadows, dim echoes of their former selves. They retained some awareness, some memory, but it was muted, softened, like voices heard through water. When the witch of Endor summoned the spirit of Samuel for King Saul, the prophet's shade rose from Sheol, disturbed and displeased at being awakened from his rest. He could speak, he could remember, he could prophesy, but he was clearly not the same vibrant figure who had once anointed kings and challenged rulers. He was a whisper of himself, a shadow cast by a life that had been. This understanding shaped how the ancient Israelites lived their daily lives. They knew that Sheol awaited everyone, that no amount of wealth or power or righteousness could change that destination. And so they focused not on earning their way into paradise, but on living well in the time they had been given. They sought to leave legacies that would outlast their bodies, to be remembered kindly by their children and their children's children. The concept of Sheol also influenced their understanding of justice. If everyone ended up in the same shadowy realm, regardless of their deeds, then justice had to be found in this life, not the next. The wicked might prosper for a time, but their prosperity was temporary. The righteous might suffer, but their suffering too would pass. In Sheol, all accounts were settled not through punishment or reward, but through the simple equality of death. There was a strange comfort in this belief, a kind of gentle resignation that allowed people to face mortality with dignity rather than terror. Death was not a monster to be feared, but a doorway to be walked through when the time came. It was not an enemy to be conquered, but a friend who came calling when life's work was done. The writers of Ecclesiastes captured this beautifully when they wrote about the futility of human endeavors. All the toil under the sun, all the striving and achieving and accumulating would ultimately lead to the same destination. The wise and the fool, the rich and the poor, all would lie down in the dust together. This wasn't meant to discourage people from living meaningful lives, but to remind them that meaning came not from what they could take with them, but from what they could give while they were here. In the book of Job, we see this understanding played out in the most profound way. Job, stripped of everything he held dear, still maintained his faith, not because he expected reward in the afterlife, but because he understood that his relationship with God transcended even death. When he declared, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him," he wasn't banking on heavenly compensation. He was expressing a faith that went deeper than personal gain or loss. The prophets too spoke of Sheol not as a place to be avoided, but as a reality to be acknowledged. Isaiah wrote of death as an enemy that would one day be swallowed up forever. But until that distant day, it remained part of the natural order. Jeremiah and Ezekiel spoke of the grave as a place of rest, a refuge from the troubles of the world above. What's particularly striking about these early biblical perspectives is how they viewed the afterlife as essentially communal rather than individual. Modern concepts of heaven and hell tend to focus on personal salvation, on individual souls being sorted into eternal destinations based on their beliefs or deeds. But Sheol was different. It was about the continuation of the people, the nation, the covenant community that transcended individual lives. When the ancient Israelites said someone had been gathered to his fathers, they weren't just using a euphemism for death. They were expressing a profound theological truth. Death was not the end of one's connection to the community of faith. It was a transition from active participation to quiet presence, from leading the way to joining the great cloud of witnesses who had completed their earthly journey. This understanding also shaped their burial practices and mourning rituals. The dead were not feared as potential sources of haunting or harm. They were honored, remembered, their graves tended with care. Families would gather at burial sites not just to grieve, but to maintain connection with those who had passed on. The living and the dead remained part of the same extended family, separated by the veil of mortality, but not by love or memory. In Sheol, according to these ancient beliefs, there was no worship, no praise, no active service to God. The psalmist wrote, In death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who will give you praise? This wasn't because God had abandoned the dead, but because their time of active service had ended. They had run their race, fought their fight, kept their faith. Now they rested while others took up the torch. Yet this rest was not empty or meaningless. It was the natural conclusion to a life well lived, the earned repose that comes after honest labour. Just as the Sabbath provided rest from the week's work, so death provided rest from life's struggles. It was not an interruption of God's plan, but part of it, woven into the very fabric of creation from the beginning. The ancient Hebrews also understood that while individual consciousness might dim in Sheol, the impact of one's life continued to ripple through the world of the living. A person's deeds, their words, their influence on others, these things had a kind of immortality that transcended physical death. In this way, the dead continued to shape the world even from their shadowy realm beneath the earth. This is why genealogies were so important in biblical literature, why the writers took such care to trace family lines and preserve the names of the ancestors. These were not mere historical records, but theological statements about the continuity of God's people across generations. The dead in Sheol were not forgotten. They remained part of the ongoing story, silent contributors to the great narrative of faith that stretched from creation toward an ultimate fulfillment. As we drift deeper into this understanding of biblical afterlife, we begin to see how different it was from both the punishment-focused hells and the reward-centered heavens that would develop in later theological traditions. Sheol was neither terrible nor wonderful. It simply was. It was the natural destination for all human souls, the quiet conclusion to every earthly story. But even in this early period, there were hints that death might not have the final word forever. The prophets occasionally spoke in mysterious terms about a future resurrection, about bones coming together and breath returning to the dead. These were not detailed descriptions of individual afterlife experiences, but glimpses of a cosmic restoration that would one day transform everything, including the realm of the dead itself. For now, though, as we settle into these ancient understandings, we find ourselves in a world where death was accepted with remarkable equanimity, where the afterlife was not a source of terror or desperate hope, but simply the next chapter in the great human story, where Sheol waited patiently for all, offering not judgment but rest, not reward but peace, not punishment but the gentle democracy of the grave. And so the biblical dead descended into their shadowy realm, carrying with them the echoes of lives lived in covenant with the divine, joining the great assembly of souls who had walked this path before them. In Sheol, they found not the end of their story, but its quiet continuation, its gentle transformation from active voice to peaceful memory. The silence of Sheol was not empty, though. It hummed with the whispered memories of countless lives, with the soft echoes of prayers once spoken, with the gentle presence of those who had completed their earthly pilgrimage. And in that silence, something profound was taking shape, something that would eventually transform how humanity understood death itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us linger here a moment longer in these ancient understandings, in this time when death was neither feared nor celebrated, but simply accepted as part of the great rhythm of existence. In the book of Samuel, when David's infant son died, the king's response reveals so much about this early biblical perspective on death. His servants were puzzled when David stopped his desperate fasting and mourning the moment the child passed away. They had expected him to grieve more deeply, not less. But David's words were simple and profound. I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. There was no anguish about the child's eternal fate, no worry about judgment or punishment. There was only the quiet certainty that death was a one-way passage, that the living could join the dead, but the dead could not return to the living. It was not cruel, this understanding. It was simply the natural order, as fixed and reliable as the rising sun. This acceptance of death's finality shaped how people lived their daily lives in ways we might find surprising today. Without the promise of heavenly reward or the threat of eternal punishment driving their choices, the ancient Israelites found their motivation elsewhere. They sought to live righteously, not because it would earn them a better afterlife, but because righteousness was its own reward, because it honored their covenant with God, because it created the kind of community where children could flourish and elders could find dignity. The wisdom literature of the Bible reflects this beautifully. The Proverbs don't promise that good behavior will be rewarded in heaven or that wickedness will be punished in hell. Instead, they speak of the natural consequences that flow from our choices in this life. Kindness creates friendship. Honesty builds trust. Cruelty destroys relationships. Dishonesty undermines community. The rewards and punishments were built into the fabric of human existence itself. Even the great prophets, those thundering voices of divine judgment, focused their attention on this world rather than the next. When Isaiah spoke of justice rolling down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, he wasn't describing some future celestial court. He was calling for transformation here and now, in the markets and courts and temples of ancient Israel. The prophets understood that God's primary concern was not with sorting souls in the afterlife, but with healing the world of the living. This earthly focus gave their faith a kind of immediacy and urgency that can be deeply moving. Every act of kindness mattered, because this life was where kindness could be expressed. Every moment of worship was precious, because this was when worship could be offered. Every relationship was sacred, because these were the people you could actually touch, actually serve, actually love. The Psalms capture this understanding with particular beauty. When the psalmist cried out in distress or sang in joy, there was no deferred hope, no promise that things would be better in the next life. There was only the raw honesty of human experience laid bare before God, the desperate need for help in the here and now, the overwhelming gratitude for blessings actually received and felt. "This is the day the Lord has made," sang the psalmist. "Let us rejoice and be glad in it." Not tomorrow, not in some future paradise, but this day, this moment, this fleeting and precious gift of conscious existence. The dead in Sheol could no longer sing such songs. They had completed their time of active praise. The responsibility now belonged to the living. And yet, even as we explore these ancient perspectives, we begin to sense something stirring in the depths of biblical thought. Like a seed germinating in dark soil, new understandings of death and afterlife were slowly taking root. The book of Daniel, written much later than the earlier biblical texts, contains one of the first clear references to resurrection. "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." This was revolutionary thinking for its time. The idea that the dead might not remain forever in their shadowy rest, that there might be some future awakening, some cosmic reversal of death itself, began to reshape how people understood their mortality. But even this early glimpse of resurrection was communal rather than individual, cosmic rather than personal. It wasn't about individuals earning their way into heaven, but about God's ultimate victory over death for all creation. The influence of surrounding cultures began to seep into Jewish thought during the centuries between the Old and New Testaments. The Greeks, with their philosophical discussions of the soul's immortality, the Persians with their dualistic vision of cosmic conflict between good and evil, the Egyptians with their elaborate afterlife mythologies. All of these traditions began to interact with and influence Jewish understanding of death and what lay beyond. During this period, known as the intertestamental period, Jewish thought began to develop more complex and varied views of the afterlife. Some groups, like the Pharisees, embraced the idea of resurrection and began to speak of rewards and punishments after death. Others, like the Sadducees, held firmly to the older biblical understanding. rejecting any notion of life after death, beyond the shadowy existence in Sheol. The book of 1st Enoch, though not included in the biblical canon, reflects some of these developing ideas. It speaks of separate destinations for the righteous and the wicked after death, of places of blessing and places of torment. The dead are no longer all gathered together in the democratic silence of Sheol, but are sorted according to their deeds and their faithfulness. This was a significant shift in thinking, one that would have profound implications for how people understood not just death, but life itself. If the afterlife involved judgment, if there were eternal consequences for earthly choices, then every decision took on cosmic significance. The stakes of moral behavior were no longer just communal and temporal, but individual and eternal. The apocalyptic literature of this period, with its vivid imagery of final judgment and cosmic transformation, reflects this new urgency. Books like 2 Esdras and 2 Baruch speak of a coming day when all the dead will be raised, when the righteous will be vindicated and the wicked punished, when the injustices of this world will finally be set right. These developments created a rich and complex theological landscape by the time of the New Testament. Different Jewish groups held different views about the afterlife, from the Sadducees' denial of any resurrection to the Pharisees' detailed discussions of the world to come. Some spoke of the soul's immediate journey to paradise or punishment after death, while others insisted that the dead remained unconscious until a future resurrection. The Essenes, the community that likely produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, developed their own unique perspectives on death and afterlife. They spoke of the soul's pre-existence and its eventual return to a spiritual realm, blending Jewish biblical thought with Hellenistic philosophical concepts. Their writings reveal a community deeply concerned with purity and preparation for the final judgment they believed was imminent. Meanwhile, in the broader Greco-Roman world, death was understood through entirely different lenses. The Greeks had long debated whether the soul was immortal, whether it survived bodily death, and what that survival might entail. Plato's dialogues explored the possibility that death was actually liberation for the soul, freeing it from the prison of the physical body to return to the realm of eternal forms. The Romans, more practically minded, focused less on philosophical speculation about the afterlife and more on the importance of being remembered by the living. Their elaborate funeral rites and tomb inscriptions reveal a culture deeply concerned with preserving one's name and deeds for posterity. Death might end individual consciousness, but it need not end one's influence on the world. Into this rich mix of competing ideas and beliefs, the New Testament writers would eventually introduce their own revolutionary understanding of death and resurrection, but that transformation was still to come. For now, in these centuries between the Testaments, we find ourselves in a world where the old certainties about Sheol were giving way to new questions, new possibilities, new hopes and fears about what lay beyond the grave. The dead, meanwhile, continued their silent rest, unaware, perhaps, of the theological debates raging above them. In Sheol, or in whatever other realms they now inhabited according to various beliefs, they remained the great cloud of witnesses, the completed lives whose stories had become part of the larger narrative of faith. Some of these stories had become legendary. Abraham, who had answered God's call to leave everything familiar and journey to an unknown land. Moses, who had led the people out of slavery and received the law on Mount Sinai. David, the shepherd boy who became king and whose psalms still echoed in the worship of the living. These figures had transcended their physical deaths to become eternal symbols of faith, courage, and devotion. Others were remembered more quietly, in family stories passed down through generations, in the gentle influence they had exercised on their children and grandchildren, in the small acts of kindness that had rippled outward through their communities long after their bodies had returned to dust. And so the biblical understanding of death continued to evolve, shaped by new experiences new encounters with other cultures, new revelations and insights. The simple certainty of Sheol as the universal destination for all the dead was giving way to more complex visions of judgment and resurrection, of paradise and punishment, of individual destinies that transcended the collective fate of the community. Yet through all these developments, certain core truths remained constant. Death was still the common lot of humanity, still the great equalizer that humbled the proud and comforted the afflicted. The dead were still deserving of honor and remembrance, still part of the ongoing story of God's people, and life, precious and brief, was still the arena where faith could be lived out, where love could be expressed, where the divine image in humanity could shine forth most clearly. The darkness of Sheol, you see, was not the darkness of punishment. It was the darkness of rest, of completion, of stories told and chapters closed. But as centuries passed and empires rose and fell around the small nation of Israel, something began to shift in the very foundations of how people understood death itself. Picture, if you will, a young scribe in Jerusalem during the time of the Maccabees, carefully copying ancient texts by lamplight. His fingers trace the familiar words about Sheol, about the gathering of souls in that shadowy realm beneath the earth. But outside his window, he can hear the sounds of war, of faithful Jews dying for their beliefs, of martyrs choosing death rather than abandoning their covenant with God. And suddenly, the old certainties don't seem quite enough. If death is merely rest, if Sheol is simply the democratic grave where all souls gather regardless of their deeds, then what meaning is there in martyrdom? What hope can be offered to those who die for their faith? What comfort exists for parents who watch their children perish rather than bow to foreign gods? It was in this crucible of suffering that new understandings began to emerge. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, like dawn breaking over the hills of Judea. The idea began to take hold that perhaps death was not the final word, that perhaps the God who had created life from dust might someday breathe life into dust again. The book of Daniel, written during these turbulent times, speaks of a future awakening. "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above," the prophet wrote, "and those who turn many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever." This was no longer about the quiet democracy of Sheol. This was about transformation, about vindication, about death itself being conquered. But even as these new ideas began to flourish, they carried within them the seeds of profound change. If the dead could be raised, if there was to be judgment and reward and punishment, then every choice in life took on eternal significance. The comfortable certainty that all souls shared the same quiet fate gave way to urgent questions about worthiness, about preparation, about what it might mean to face divine judgment. The Pharisees, those careful students of the law, embraced these new possibilities with scholarly enthusiasm. They debated the nature of the resurrection body, the timing of the final judgment, the rewards that awaited the righteous, and the punishments reserved for the wicked. Their discussions filled the synagogues and academies, creating elaborate theological systems that attempted to map the geography of the world to come. Meanwhile, the Sadducees, holding firmly to the older biblical traditions, rejected such innovations entirely. They pointed to the Torah, to the ancient writings that spoke only of Sheol, only of death as the common destiny of all humanity. To them, these new ideas about resurrection were dangerous departures from revealed truth, foreign concepts that had no place in authentic Jewish faith. The tension between these perspectives created a rich tapestry of belief and debate. In the marketplaces of Jerusalem, ordinary people heard competing voices. One teacher might speak of the soul's immediate journey to paradise or punishment after death. Another might insist that the dead slept unconsciously until the great resurrection day. Still others described elaborate journeys through various spiritual realms, drawing on mystical traditions that blended Jewish thought with influences from the broader Mediterranean world. The Essenes, living their ascetic life in the wilderness near the Dead Sea, developed their own unique understanding of death and afterlife. They spoke of the soul as a divine spark temporarily imprisoned in flesh, destined to return to its celestial home. Their writings describe the righteous dead dwelling in a place of light and joy, while the wicked face eternal torment. For them, death was not rest, but liberation, not ending, but homecoming. These communities understood something profound about the human need for meaning in the face of mortality. The old certainties about Sheol, beautiful in their simplicity, had served well for generations. But as the world grew more complex, as suffering increased and questions multiplied, faith required new language, new imagery, new hopes to sustain people through their darkest hours. Consider the mother who loses her child to plague, or the father who watches his son die in battle against foreign oppressors. The promise that their loved ones now rest peacefully in Sheol alongside all the dead might bring some comfort, but it cannot fully answer the cry of the heart that demands meaning, that insists such losses must somehow serve a greater purpose. And so the writers of this period began to speak of death not as the end of the story, but as a chapter break, a pause before the final act. They wrote of resurrection not as return to ordinary life, but as transformation into something greater, something that would make sense of all the suffering and injustice that seemed to mock divine goodness in the present world. The book of 2nd Maccabees tells the story of 7 brothers who chose torture and death rather than abandon their faith. As each one faced execution, they spoke not of quiet rest in Sheol, but of confident hope in resurrection. The King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, declared one as he stretched out his hands to be cut off. This was faith transformed, hope reborn, death redefined as temporary defeat rather than final victory. Yet even as these new understandings spread, they brought with them new anxieties. If death led to judgment, if eternity hung in the balance of earthly choices, then how could anyone feel confident about their fate? The comfortable universality of Sheol gave way to the terrifying possibility of individual damnation, of eternal separation from God and community. The apocalyptic literature of this period reflects these fears in vivid, sometimes disturbing imagery. The Book of Enoch describes separate chambers for different categories of souls, places of blessing for the righteous, and places of torment for the wicked. The dead are no longer the peaceful community of Sheol, but are sorted and separated according to their deeds and their faithfulness. This sorting of souls created new questions about the criteria for judgment. Was it enough to follow the law faithfully? Did God judge the heart or only actions? What about those who lived before the law was given, or those who never had the chance to hear God's commandments? The theological implications were staggering, and different groups developed different answers. Some emphasized the importance of ritual observance, arguing that careful attention to the details of religious law would ensure divine favor. Others focused on ethical behavior, insisting that justice and mercy mattered more than ceremonial correctness. Still others spoke of divine grace, of God's willingness to forgive and restore even those who had failed to meet perfect standards. The influence of Greek philosophy during this period cannot be overlooked. As Alexander the Great's conquest spread Hellenistic culture throughout the Mediterranean world, Jewish thinkers encountered new ways of understanding the soul, the body, and the relationship between them. Plato's teaching about the soul's immortality began to blend with Jewish beliefs about resurrection, creating hybrid theologies that attempted to honor both traditions. Some Jewish writers began to speak of the soul as naturally immortal, temporarily clothed in flesh, but destined to return to its spiritual home after death. This was quite different from the biblical understanding of humans as unified beings, body and soul together, who faced complete death and required divine intervention for any kind of continuation beyond the grave. The tension between these perspectives would continue to influence Jewish and later Christian thought for centuries. Was the soul immortal by nature or by divine gift? Did death affect the whole person or only the body? Was resurrection about the restoration of the complete human being or about the soul's reunion with a transformed body? Meanwhile, the practical implications of these theological developments began to reshape how people lived their daily lives. If judgment awaited after death, then every action mattered. Every choice carried eternal weight. The casual acceptance of mortality that had characterized earlier biblical thought gave way to intense concern about spiritual preparation. New practices emerged to help people prepare for death and judgment. Detailed instructions developed about proper burial rituals, not just to honor the dead, but to ensure their safe passage to whatever realm awaited them. Prayers for the dead became common, reflecting belief that the living could somehow influence the fate of those who had already died. The concept of merit began to play a larger role in religious thinking. Good deeds could be stored up like treasure, creating a kind of spiritual bank account that might prove decisive in the final judgment. This led to increased emphasis on charity, on ritual observance, on study of sacred texts, all as ways of building up merit for the world to come. Yet even as these new ideas flourished, the older biblical wisdom remained alive in the hearts of many believers. The Psalms continued to be sung, with their focus on God's presence in this life rather than rewards in the next. The wisdom literature continued to be studied, with its emphasis on the natural consequences of good and evil choices rather than supernatural judgment. The book of Ecclesiastes, with its haunting refrain about the vanity of human endeavors, offered a counterpoint to the growing emphasis on eternal rewards. "For the living know that they will die," wrote the preacher, "but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten." This was the old understanding asserting itself, reminding readers that whatever lay beyond death, the primary arena for human meaning remained the present moment. The tension between these perspectives created a rich theological ecosystem where different communities could find different answers to the fundamental questions about mortality and meaning. Some embraced the new teachings about resurrection and judgment with enthusiasm, finding in them hope for ultimate justice and vindication. Others held fast to the older certainties, trusting in God's faithfulness without need for detailed maps of the afterlife. The diversity of belief during this period is remarkable. Archaeological evidence reveals burial practices that reflect different understandings of death and afterlife, sometimes within the same community. Some graves are simple, reflecting the old view that death was simply return to dust. Others are elaborate, suggesting belief in continued existence that might be influenced by the treatment of the body. Inscriptions on tombs from this period reveal the theological complexity of the time. Some speak confidently of resurrection and eternal life. Others use the traditional language of being gathered to one's people. Still others reflect uncertainty, expressing hope without claiming certainty about what lies beyond the grave. This uncertainty was not necessarily a weakness. It reflected the honest recognition that death remained a mystery, that human understanding could only go so far in comprehending the divine purposes. The proliferation of different views about the afterlife demonstrated not confusion, but humility, not ignorance, but wisdom about the limits of human knowledge. The communities that produce the Dead Sea Scrolls offer particularly fascinating insights into this theological diversity. Their writings reveal intense interest in the fate of the soul after death, with detailed descriptions of the rewards awaiting the righteous and the punishments reserved for the wicked. Yet they also preserve much older traditions about Sheol and the common destiny of all humanity. One scroll describes a vision of the righteous dead dwelling in a place of light and joy, served by angels and experiencing perfect peace. Another speaks of the wicked suffering in a place of darkness and torment, their cries echoing through eternity. Yet a third returns to the ancient language of sleep and rest, describing death as a peaceful conclusion to earthly labor. These varied perspectives existed side by side within the same community, suggesting that ancient people were comfortable with theological diversity in ways that might surprise modern readers. Different texts could offer different insights into the mystery of death, without necessarily contradicting each other. The afterlife was simply too vast, too profound, for any single human perspective to capture completely. The influence of these developing ideas began to spread beyond Jewish communities. The Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, known as the Septuagint, introduced many non-Jews to biblical perspectives on death and afterlife. At the same time, Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean world encountered local beliefs and practices that influenced their own understanding. In Egypt, where Jewish communities had existed for centuries, the elaborate afterlife beliefs of the pharaohs created new questions and possibilities. Could the biblical God guide souls through the complex journey that Egyptian religion described? Did the detailed preparations for death that characterized Egyptian practice have any relevance for those who worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? In Greece and Rome, philosophical discussions of the soul's immortality provided new vocabulary and concepts for Jewish thinkers wrestling with questions about life after death. The idea that reason itself might provide clues about the soul's destiny began to influence how some Jewish writers approached these ancient mysteries. Yet through all these cultural encounters and theological developments, certain core convictions remained constant. Death was still understood as the consequence of human mortality, not as punishment for individual sin. The dead were still deserving of honor and remembrance, still part of the ongoing community of faith, and God's ultimate purpose was still understood as the restoration and blessing of creation, not its destruction or abandonment. The period between the Old and New Testaments thus represents a time of tremendous creativity and diversity in thinking about death and afterlife. The simple certainties of Sheol gave way to complex visions of judgment and resurrection, of paradise and punishment, of souls sorted according to their deeds and their faithfulness. Yet the older wisdom remained alive as well, offering its own insights into the mystery of mortality and the meaning of human existence. As we drift through these ancient understandings, we begin to sense the profound transformation that was taking place in human consciousness itself. The acceptance of death as natural and inevitable was giving way to the conviction that death was an enemy to be conquered, a temporary interruption in the divine plan for human flourishing. This shift would have enormous implications for how people understood not just death but life itself, not just individual destiny but cosmic purpose. The stage was being set for even more radical transformation, for new revelations about the nature of death and the possibility of life beyond the grave. But for now, in these centuries of transition and development, we find ourselves in a world where the old and new existed side by side, where ancient certainties mingled with emerging hopes, where the democracy of Sheol slowly gave way to more complex visions of eternal justice and mercy. The dead of this transitional period found themselves caught between worlds, between the ancient certainty of Sheol's democratic silence and the emerging promise of resurrection's selective dawn. In the shadowy realm beneath the earth, they waited, perhaps sensing the theological earthquakes occurring in the world above. The gradual shift from collective destiny to individual judgment that would reshape human understanding of mortality forever. Picture a young woman named Miriam living in Jerusalem during the time when Greek culture pressed against Jewish tradition like water against a dam. She had grown up hearing her grandmother's stories about Sheol, that quiet place where all souls gathered regardless of their earthly station. But now, in the synagogue, she heard new teachings, whispered conversations about resurrection, about judgment, about the possibility that death might not have the final word after all. When Miriam's infant son died during a particularly harsh winter, she found herself torn between competing consolations. The old wisdom told her that her child now rested peacefully in Sheol, gathered to his people like Abraham and Isaac before him. But the new teachings whispered of something more, of a future day when the righteous dead would wake to everlasting life, when mothers would hold their children again in bodies transformed and perfected. Which comfort should she choose? Which hope should sustain her through the long nights of grief? The question itself revealed how profoundly the understanding of death was changing. What had once been a matter of simple acceptance was becoming a landscape of competing possibilities, each with its own implications for how the living should conduct themselves. The rabbis of this period struggled with these same tensions. In their study houses and courts, they debated not just what happened after death, but what such beliefs meant for the living. If resurrection awaited the righteous, then righteousness took on new urgency. If judgment followed death, then every action required careful consideration. If the dead could be rewarded or punished based on their earthly deeds, then the very nature of morality shifted from communal benefit to eternal consequence. Some teachers embrace these developments with enthusiasm, seeing in them the natural evolution of divine revelation. They argued that God had always intended resurrection, that the hints scattered throughout the older scriptures were finally being understood correctly. The dry bones in Ezekiel's vision, the promise that death would be swallowed up forever, even Hannah's song about the Lord bringing up from Sheol, all of these suddenly seemed like prophecies of the resurrection that was to come. Others resisted, insisting that the ancient ways were sufficient. They pointed to the clear statements in Ecclesiastes about the dead knowing nothing, to the psalmist's declaration that in death there is no remembrance of God. They argued that these new ideas were foreign innovations, Greek philosophy dressed up in Jewish clothing, dangerous departures from the faith of their fathers. The tension created by these competing views can be felt in the literature of the period. The Book of Wisdom, written by a Jewish author deeply influenced by Greek thought, speaks confidently of the soul's immortality and the rewards awaiting the righteous after death. The souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, the author declares, and no torment will ever touch them. This was a far cry from the shadowy existence described in the older biblical texts. Yet even this same book acknowledges the continuing power of the ancient understanding. The author speaks of death as sleep, of the righteous being at peace, of the importance of being remembered by the living. The new ideas about individual judgment and eternal reward were layered over, rather than replacing, the older communal understanding of death as returned to the ancestors. This layering created a rich but sometimes confusing theological landscape. A single community might hold multiple views about the afterlife simultaneously, drawing on different traditions for different purposes. In times of persecution, the promise of resurrection and vindication provided crucial hope. In times of ordinary loss, the gentle certainty of rest in Sheol offered comfort. In moments of moral crisis, the possibility of divine judgment encouraged right behavior. The apocalyptic writers of this period took these developing ideas and painted them in vivid, sometimes startling colors. The Book of Enoch describes a cosmic tour of the realms of the dead, with separate compartments for different categories of souls. The righteous dwell in a place of springs and light, while the wicked suffer in a pit of fire and darkness. The author provides detailed geography for the afterlife, mapping territories that earlier generations had left shrouded in mystery. These elaborate descriptions served multiple purposes. They satisfied human curiosity about what lay beyond the grave, providing concrete images for abstract hopes and fears. They offered comfort to those who suffered injustice in this life, promising that divine judgment would eventually set all accounts right. And they encouraged moral behavior by making the consequences of choices vividly real and eternally significant. Yet the very detail of these visions also created new problems. If the afterlife was so clearly mapped, if the criteria for judgment were so specifically defined, then why did uncertainty remain? Why did different teachers offer different descriptions of what awaited the dead? Why did even the most faithful believers sometimes doubt whether their deeds would prove sufficient to earn divine favor? The answer lay partly in the recognition that human language and imagination, however inspired, could only approximate divine realities. The apocalyptic writers themselves often acknowledged this limitation, describing their visions as glimpses rather than complete revelations, as symbolic rather than literal truth. They understood that they were painting with earthly colors a reality that transcended earthly categories. This humility in the face of mystery remained a constant thread throughout the development of afterlife beliefs during this period. Even as new ideas flourished and detailed theologies emerged, wise teachers continued to emphasize the ultimate unknowability of death's secrets. The Talmudic saying that, "No eye has seen what God has prepared for those who love him," reflected this awareness that divine purposes exceeded human comprehension. The practical implications of this theological diversity were profound. Different communities developed different practices around death and mourning, reflecting their varying beliefs about what happened to the deceased. Some focused on proper burial rituals, believing that the treatment of the body could influence the soul's journey. Others emphasized prayers and good deeds performed on behalf of the dead, suggesting that the living could still affect the fate of those who had passed on. The concept of merit, which had always played some role in Jewish thought, became increasingly important during this period. Good deeds were understood not just as pleasing to God or beneficial to the community, but as building up a treasury of merit that might prove decisive in the final judgment. This led to increased emphasis on charity, on ritual observance, on study of sacred texts, all as ways of preparing for the world to come. Yet this focus on merit also created new anxieties. If salvation depended on accumulating sufficient good deeds, how could anyone be certain they had done enough? If judgment was based on perfect adherence to divine law, who could claim to have achieved such perfection? The comfort of Sheol's democracy, where all souls shared the same quiet fate, gave way to the terror of individual accountability, where each person stood alone before divine justice. Some teachers tried to address these concerns by emphasizing divine mercy alongside divine justice. They spoke of God's willingness to forgive, of the possibility that sincere repentance could outweigh past failures, of the hope that divine love was stronger than human weakness. These teachings provided comfort to those who feared they could never earn their way into paradise through their own efforts. The influence of these developing ideas extended beyond Jewish communities into the broader Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman writers began to encounter Jewish perspectives on death and afterlife, sometimes adopting or adapting them for their own purposes. The idea of resurrection, virtually unknown in classical Greek thought, began to appear in some philosophical discussions. The concept of divine judgment after death, while not entirely foreign to Greek and Roman religion, took on new dimensions through contact with Jewish theology. At the same time, Jewish communities throughout the diaspora encountered local beliefs and practices that influenced their own understanding. In Egypt, the elaborate afterlife mythology of the pharaohs provided new imagery and concepts. In Mesopotamia, ancient traditions about the underworld offered different perspectives on the fate of the dead. In Greece and Rome, philosophical discussions of the soul's nature and destiny created new vocabulary for expressing Jewish beliefs. This cross-cultural exchange enriched the theological landscape, but also created new tensions. How much adaptation was acceptable? Could Jewish beliefs about the afterlife be expressed in Greek philosophical terms without losing their essential character? Could local burial customs be adopted without compromising faith commitments? These questions required careful consideration and often led to different answers in different communities. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals the complexity of these cultural interactions. Jewish tombs in the diaspora often combine traditional Jewish symbols with local artistic styles. Inscriptions blend Hebrew and Aramaic religious language with Greek philosophical concepts. Burial practices reflect both Jewish concerns about proper treatment of the body and local customs about preparing the dead for their journey to the afterlife. One particularly striking example comes from the Jewish catacombs in Rome, where elaborate frescoes depict biblical scenes alongside images drawn from Greco-Roman mythology. The artists who created these works were clearly attempting to express Jewish beliefs about death and resurrection using artistic vocabulary that would be familiar to their cosmopolitan audience. The result is a unique fusion of traditions that speaks to the creative adaptation occurring throughout the Jewish diaspora. The rabbinic literature that began to emerge during this period reflects these same tensions and adaptations. The early Mishnah and Talmudic discussions about death and afterlife show awareness of diverse viewpoints and careful attention to the implications of different beliefs. The rabbis were not content simply to collect different opinions. They sought to understand how these beliefs should shape practical behavior and community life. One of the most significant developments was the emergence of detailed discussions about the resurrection body. If the dead were to be raised, what kind of bodies would they have? Would they be identical to their earthly forms, or somehow transformed? Would they age or remain forever at their prime? Would they need food and drink, or exist in some more spiritual state? These questions might seem abstract, but they had practical implications for how people understood their earthly bodies and their preparation for the world to come. The rabbis' answers to these questions were characteristically nuanced. They spoke of the resurrection body as both continuous with and transformed from the earthly body, identical enough to preserve personal identity, but different enough to exist in the perfected world to come. They debated whether physical pleasures would exist in the resurrection, whether marriage and procreation would continue, whether the social relationships of this world would persist in the next. These discussions reveal a deep concern with preserving both the value of earthly existence and the hope of something greater beyond it. The resurrection was not understood as an escape from physical reality, but as its ultimate fulfillment. The body was not a prison for the soul, but an integral part of human identity that would be restored and perfected in the world to come. This positive view of embodied existence distinguished Jewish thought from much Greek philosophy, which tended to see the body as a temporary vessel for the immortal soul. For Jewish thinkers, humans were not souls temporarily trapped in flesh, but unified beings, body and soul together, created in the image of God and destined for resurrection as complete persons. The implications of this understanding extended into every area of life. If the body was destined for resurrection, then caring for physical health became a religious duty. If earthly relationships would be transformed rather than abolished in the world to come, then building loving connections in this life took on eternal significance. If the material world was to be redeemed rather than abandoned, then working for justice and peace in the present became preparation for the future. These ideas began to reshape Jewish practice in subtle but important ways. Burial customs evolved to reflect beliefs about the resurrection body. Mourning rituals developed to comfort those who grieved while affirming hope for future reunion. Prayers emerged that asked for divine mercy on behalf of the dead and expressed confidence in their eventual restoration. The influence of these developments can be seen in the Jewish liturgy that was taking shape during this period. Prayers that had once focused primarily on God's faithfulness in this world began to include references to resurrection and the world to come. The ancient blessing over bread was supplemented with prayers that looked forward to the messianic banquet. The daily recitation of the Shema was surrounded with blessings that affirmed both God's presence in this world and God's promise of redemption in the next. Yet even as these new elements entered Jewish worship, the older themes remained strong. The Psalms continued to be central to Jewish prayer, with their focus on God's presence in this life rather than rewards in the next. The wisdom literature continued to be studied and quoted, with its emphasis on the natural consequences of good and evil choices rather than supernatural judgment. The tension between old and new was creative rather than destructive, producing a rich synthesis that honored both ancient wisdom and emerging hope. The diversity of belief during this period is perhaps best illustrated by the story of the Pharisees and Sadducees, two Jewish groups that held fundamentally different views about the afterlife. The Pharisees embraced the new teachings about resurrection and judgment, developing elaborate theologies to explain how these beliefs fit with the ancient scriptures. The Sadducees rejected such innovations entirely, insisting that the Torah contained no clear teaching about life after death, and that speculation about such matters was therefore pointless. The conflict between these groups was not merely academic. It had practical implications for how they understood the purpose of life, the nature of justice, and the relationship between this world and whatever might come after. For the Pharisees, the promise of resurrection provided crucial hope for ultimate justice and vindication. For the Sadducees, the absence of clear biblical teaching about the afterlife meant that justice had to be found in this world or not at all. Both perspectives had their strengths and weaknesses. The Pharisees' belief in resurrection provided comfort to those who suffered injustice and encouraged moral behavior through the promise of future reward and punishment. But it also created anxiety about individual worthiness and could lead to a preoccupation with earning merit for the world to come. The Sadducees' focus on this world encouraged practical action to improve present conditions and avoided the pitfalls of otherworldly speculation. But it could also lead to despair when injustice seemed to triumph and offered little comfort to those facing death. The New Testament writers, when they eventually appeared on the scene, would find themselves navigating this complex theological landscape. They would draw on both traditions, affirming the Pharisees' belief in resurrection while sharing the Sadducees' concern for justice in this world. They would inherit centuries of development in thinking about death and afterlife, building on this foundation while adding their own revolutionary insights. But that transformation was still to come. For now, in these centuries between the Testaments, we find ourselves in a world where the old certainties about Sheol were giving way to new possibilities, where the democracy of death was being challenged by visions of individual judgment, where the quiet rest of the grave was being replaced by hopes of resurrection and fears of eternal punishment. The dead of this period, if they were aware of these theological developments, might have found them both comforting and troubling. The promise of resurrection offered hope that death was not the final word, that the injustices of this life would be corrected in the next. But the possibility of judgment also created new uncertainties about what fate awaited each individual soul. In Sheol, or in whatever other realms they now inhabited according to various beliefs, the dead continued their patient existence, perhaps sensing that their quiet era was drawing to a close. The great theological revolution was underway, slowly but inexorably transforming how humanity understood death itself. The simple certainties of the ancient world were giving way to complex visions of eternal consequence, individual accountability, and cosmic judgment. Yet through all these changes, certain truths remained constant. Death was still the common lot of humanity, still the great mystery that no amount of theological speculation could fully illuminate. The dead were still deserving of honor and remembrance, still part of the ongoing story of God's people, and the living were still called to faithfulness, still challenged to live with integrity and compassion, regardless of what rewards or punishments might await them beyond the grave. The transformation was far from complete. New questions were emerging faster than answers could be found. The theological landscape was becoming more complex, more diverse, more filled with competing possibilities. But in this very complexity lay the seeds of a revolution that would eventually transform not just Jewish thought, but the entire world's understanding of death and what lay beyond it. For now, though, the ancient rhythms continued. The sun rose and set over Jerusalem. Children were born and grew old and died. Families gathered to mourn their losses and celebrate their joys. Scribes copied ancient texts and debated their meanings. Pilgrims journeyed to the temple and offered their sacrifices. And somewhere beneath it all, in the quiet depths of human consciousness, new understanding of mortality and meaning was slowly taking shape. The dead waited patiently in their shadowy realm, unaware perhaps that their eternal rest was about to be disturbed by the most revolutionary idea in human history, that death itself might not be permanent, that the grave might not be victorious, that resurrection was not just a distant hope, but an approaching reality that would transform everything, including the very nature of what it meant to be human. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Let us linger here a moment longer in this time of transition, in this era when the old and new existed side by side, when ancient certainties mingled with emerging possibilities, when the simple democracy of Sheol was slowly giving way to more complex visions of judgment and redemption. The story is far from over, and the most dramatic chapters are yet to come. But what happens when the very foundations of belief begin to crack? When the comfortable certainties that have sustained generations suddenly seem insufficient to explain the suffering witnessed, the injustices endured, the questions that multiply faster than answers can be found. Picture yourself as a temple priest in Jerusalem during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, watching in horror as foreign soldiers defile the sacred altar, force faithful Jews to eat pork, and execute those who refuse to abandon their ancestral ways. The old assurances about Sheol, about the peaceful democracy of death, where all souls rest equally, begin to feel hollow in the face of such persecution. What comfort is there in telling a mother whose son died defending the temple that he now rests quietly alongside his tormentors? It was in moments like these that the ancient understanding began to strain, began to bend, began to transform into something altogether different. The comfortable universality of Sheol could not hold the weight of martyrdom, could not contain the burning question of justice delayed, could not satisfy hearts that cried out for meaning in meaningless suffering. And so, slowly, carefully, like scribes adding vowel points to ancient consonants, new understandings began to emerge. Not revolutionary at first, not dramatic proclamations that overturned everything that came before, but gentle additions, subtle expansions, quiet recognitions, that perhaps the story of death was more complex than their ancestors had imagined. The book of Daniel, emerging from this crucible of persecution, dared to speak what had been whispered in corners, hoped for in secret, dreamed of in the darkest hours before dawn. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, the prophet wrote, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with possibility, pregnant with transformation. This was no longer about the collective fate of the people. This was personal, individual, intimate. Each soul would face its own destiny, its own judgment, its own eternal consequence. The democracy of Sheol was giving way to something far more complex, far more demanding, far more terrifying and wonderful than anything that had come before. But revolution, even theological revolution, rarely comes all at once. It seeps in like water through limestone, gradually reshaping the landscape of belief. Some embrace these new possibilities with the fervour of the desperate, finding in them the only hope that could sustain faith in the face of overwhelming darkness. Others resisted, clinging to the ancient certainties like sailors to a familiar shore in an unfamiliar storm. The Pharisees, those careful students of the law, saw in resurrection the natural flowering of seeds planted long ago in the sacred texts. Had not Ezekiel seen the valley of dry bones stirring to life? Had not Hannah sung of the Lord bringing up from Sheol? Had not Isaiah spoken of death being swallowed up forever? Perhaps these were not merely poetic flourishes, but prophetic glimpses of a truth too wonderful for earlier generations to fully comprehend. They developed elaborate theologies to explain how resurrection would work, what kind of bodies the dead would possess, when the Great Awakening would occur. Their debates filled the study houses with passionate argumentation, creating scholarly traditions that would influence Jewish thought for centuries to come. They spoke of the world to come, of the age of the Messiah, of a time when all the injustices of history would finally be set right. Meanwhile, the Sadducees, those aristocratic keepers of traditional religion, watched these developments with growing alarm. They pointed to the Torah, to the 5 books of Moses that said nothing explicit about resurrection, nothing clear about individual judgment after death. These new ideas, they argued, were foreign innovations, Greek philosophy dressed in Jewish clothing, dangerous departures from the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their resistance was not merely conservative stubbornness. It reflected a deep understanding that changing how people thought about death would inevitably change how they lived their lives. If every action carried eternal weight, if every choice echoed through eternity, then the comfortable rhythms of traditional religious life would be disrupted forever. The stakes of existence would become unbearably high. Yet even as these theological battles raged in the halls of learning, ordinary people found themselves caught between competing consolations. When a child died, should parents take comfort in the ancient assurance that their little one now rested peacefully in Sheol? Or should they pin their hopes on the emerging promise that resurrection might someday restore what death had taken? The choice itself revealed how profoundly the understanding of mortality was changing. The literature of this period reflects these tensions beautifully. The book of Ecclesiastes, with its haunting meditations on the vanity of human endeavors, represents the old wisdom in its purest form. For the living know that they will die, the preacher wrote, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. This was the ancient voice, speaking with the authority of centuries, reminding readers that whatever lay beyond death, the primary arena for human meaning remained the present moment. But alongside this ancient wisdom, new voices were emerging. The Book of Wisdom, written by a Jewish author, deeply influenced by Greek thought, spoke confidently of the soul's immortality and the rewards awaiting the righteous. The righteous live forever, the author declared, and their reward is with the Lord. The care of them is with the Most High. This was no longer about collective destiny, but about individual transformation, about souls that would somehow transcend the limitations of mortal flesh. The tension between these perspectives created a rich but sometimes bewildering theological landscape. A single community might hold multiple views simultaneously, drawing on different traditions for different purposes. The grandmother's stories about Sheol might comfort a grieving family, while the rabbi's teachings about resurrection might inspire a young man to choose martyrdom rather than apostasy. This theological diversity was not necessarily a weakness. It reflected the honest recognition that death remained a mystery, that human understanding could only go so far in comprehending divine purposes. The proliferation of different views about the afterlife demonstrated not confusion, but humility. Not ignorance, but wisdom about the limits of human knowledge. The communities that produce the Dead Sea Scrolls offer particularly fascinating insights into this complexity. Their writings reveal intense interest in the fate of the soul after death, with detailed descriptions of the rewards awaiting the righteous and the punishments reserved for the wicked. They spoke of the spirits of truth and falsehood battling for human souls, of final judgment that would separate the sons of light from the sons of darkness, of an eternal inheritance that made all earthly suffering worthwhile. Yet these same communities preserved much older traditions about Sheol and the common destiny of humanity. One scroll might describe elaborate hierarchies in the afterlife, while another returned to the ancient language of sleep and rest. The diversity within a single collection suggests that ancient people were comfortable with theological complexity in ways that might surprise modern readers. The influence of surrounding cultures during this period cannot be ignored. As Alexander's conquests spread Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean world, Jewish thinkers encountered new ways of understanding the soul, the body, and the relationship between them. Plato's teachings about the soul's immortality began to blend with Jewish beliefs about resurrection, creating hybrid theologies that attempted to honor both traditions. Some Jewish writers began to speak of the soul as naturally immortal, temporarily clothed in flesh, but destined to return to its spiritual home after death. This was quite different from the biblical understanding of humans as unified beings, body and soul together, who faced complete death and required divine intervention for any kind of continuation beyond the grave. The tension between these perspectives would influence Jewish and later Christian thought for centuries. Was the soul immortal by nature or by divine gift? Did death affect the whole person or only the body? Was resurrection about the restoration of the complete human being or about the soul's reunion with a transformed body? These questions required careful consideration and often led to different answers in different communities. Meanwhile, in the broader Mediterranean world, death was understood through entirely different lenses. The mystery religions of Greece and Rome promised initiates special knowledge about the afterlife, secret teachings that would ensure safe passage through the perils of death. The Egyptian traditions, with their elaborate mummification practices and detailed guides for navigating the underworld, suggested that proper preparation could guarantee favorable treatment in the world beyond. Jewish communities throughout the diaspora encountered these beliefs and practices, sometimes adopting elements that seemed compatible with their own traditions, sometimes developing new syntheses that attempted to bridge different worldviews. The result was a rich tapestry of belief and practice that defied simple categorization. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals the complexity of these cultural interactions. Jewish tombs often combine traditional symbols with local artistic styles. Inscriptions blend Hebrew religious language with Greek philosophical concepts. Burial practices reflect both Jewish concerns about proper treatment of the body and local customs about preparing the dead for their journey to the afterlife. One particularly striking example comes from a Jewish cemetery in Egypt, where elaborate tomb paintings depict the deceased journeying through various realms, guided by figures that seem to combine Jewish angels with Egyptian gods. The artists were clearly attempting to express Jewish beliefs about death and judgment using imagery that would be familiar to their multicultural community. This creative adaptation was not mere compromise or confusion. It reflected the deep human need to make sense of mortality using whatever resources were available. If Greek philosophy offered useful vocabulary for expressing Jewish hopes, if Egyptian imagery provided compelling metaphors for divine judgment, if local burial customs contained wisdom about honoring the dead, then faithful Jews could incorporate these elements without abandoning their core convictions. The practical implications of these theological developments were profound. If the dead faced judgment, then the living needed to prepare. If resurrection awaited the righteous, then righteousness took on new urgency. If the soul continued after death, then caring for the soul became as important as caring for the body. New practices emerged to help people navigate these concerns. Detailed instructions developed about proper burial rituals, not just to honor the dead, but to ensure their safe passage to whatever realm awaited them. Prayers for the dead became common, reflecting belief that the living could somehow influence the fate of those who had already died. The concept of merit began to play a larger role, with good deeds understood as building up treasure for the world to come. Yet even as these new ideas flourished, they brought with them new anxieties. If judgment awaited after death, if eternity hung in the balance of earthly choices, then how could anyone feel confident about their fate? The comfortable universality of Sheol gave way to the terrifying possibility of individual damnation, of eternal separation from God and community. Some teachers tried to address these concerns by emphasizing divine mercy alongside divine justice. They spoke of God's willingness to forgive, of the possibility that sincere repentance could outweigh past failures, of the hope that divine love was stronger than human weakness. These teachings provided comfort to those who feared they could never earn their way into paradise through their own efforts. The emergence of detailed maps of the afterlife during this period reflects both the human desire for certainty and the recognition that such certainty was ultimately beyond human grasp. The Book of Enoch describes a cosmic tour of the realms of the dead, with separate compartments for different categories of souls. The righteous dwell in a place of springs and light, while the wicked suffer in chambers of darkness and cold. These elaborate descriptions served multiple purposes. They satisfied human curiosity about what lay beyond the grave, providing concrete images for abstract hopes and fears. They offered comfort to those who suffered injustice in this life, promising that divine judgment would eventually set all accounts right, and they encouraged moral behavior by making the consequences of choices vividly real and eternally significant. Yet, the very detail of these visions also created new problems. If the afterlife was so clearly mapped, if the criteria for judgment were so specifically defined, then why did uncertainty remain? Why did different teachers offer different descriptions of what awaited the dead? Why did even the most faithful believers sometimes doubt whether their deeds would prove sufficient to earn divine favor? The answer lay partly in the recognition that human language and imagination, however inspired, could only approximate divine realities. The visionary writers themselves often acknowledged this limitation, describing their revelations as glimpses rather than complete disclosures, as symbolic rather than literal truth. They understood that they were painting with earthly colors, a reality that transcended earthly categories. This humility in the face of mystery remained a constant thread throughout the development of afterlife beliefs during this period. Even as new ideas flourished and detailed theologies emerged, wise teachers continued to emphasize the ultimate unknowability of death's secrets. The recognition that divine purposes exceeded human comprehension provided a necessary corrective to the tendency toward theological overconfidence. The influence of these developing ideas began to reshape Jewish worship and practice in subtle but important ways. Prayers that had once focused primarily on God's faithfulness in this world began to include references to resurrection and the world to come. The ancient blessings were supplemented with new petitions that looked forward to the age of the Messiah. The daily rhythm of religious life began to incorporate preparation for the final judgment alongside gratitude for present blessings. Yet even as these new elements entered Jewish spiritual life, the older themes remained strong. The Psalms continued to be central to Jewish prayer, with their focus on God's presence in this life, rather than rewards in the next. The wisdom literature continued to be studied and quoted, with its emphasis on the natural consequences of good and evil choices rather than supernatural judgment. The tension between old and new was creative rather than destructive, producing a rich synthesis that honored both ancient wisdom and emerging hope. Different communities found different ways of balancing these perspectives, creating local traditions that reflected their particular circumstances and needs. Some emphasized the continuity between this world and the next, seeing resurrection as the completion rather than the replacement of earthly existence. Others focused on the transformation that death would bring, describing the world to come as utterly different from anything experienced in this life. Still others maintained the older emphasis on this world as the primary arena for divine human interaction, treating speculations about the afterlife as interesting but ultimately secondary concerns. The diversity of belief during this period created space for different temperaments and circumstances. Those facing persecution could find hope in promises of vindication beyond the grave. Those enjoying prosperity could focus on gratitude for present blessings. Those struggling with loss could choose between the comfort of reunion and the peace of rest, depending on which offered greater solace. This theological flexibility was not mere relativism or indifference. It reflected a mature understanding that the mystery of death was too vast for any single human perspective to capture completely. Different aspects of divine truth might be glimpsed from different angles. Different metaphors might illumine different facets of eternal reality. The emergence of messianic expectations during this period added another layer of complexity to beliefs about death and afterlife. If a Messiah was coming to establish God's kingdom on earth, what would happen to those who died before that glorious day? Would they miss the fulfillment of all their hopes? Would they remain in Sheol while others enjoyed the messianic age? Some teachers developed elaborate scenarios to address these concerns. They spoke of a general resurrection that would coincide with the Messiah's arrival, allowing all the faithful dead to participate in the kingdom they had hoped for but never seen. Others described intermediate states, temporary destinations where souls would wait until the final fulfillment of divine purposes. These speculations reveal the deep human need for narrative coherence, for stories that make sense of both individual mortality and cosmic purpose. If God had plans for history, if there was meaning in the long arc of human experience, then individual deaths had to fit somehow into that larger story. The afterlife became not just a personal destination, but part of a grand drama that would eventually culminate in divine victory over all the forces that opposed justice and peace. The Book of Daniel, with its visions of kingdoms rising and falling, its prophecies of final judgment and eternal reward, provided a template for this kind of cosmic thinking. The individual's fate was inseparable from the destiny of the people. The resurrection of the dead was connected to the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. The end of history was also the beginning of something utterly new. This connection between personal and cosmic eschatology would prove enormously influential in later Jewish and Christian thought. It meant that death was not just about individual souls facing divine judgment, but about the entire creation moving toward its ultimate fulfillment. The dead were not just waiting for personal vindication, but participating somehow in the great work of cosmic redemption. Yet even as these grand visions flourished, the practical questions remained. What should the living do to prepare for death and judgment? How should communities care for the dying and remember the dead? What rituals and practices best honored both the mystery of mortality and the hope of resurrection? Different groups developed different answers to these questions. Some emphasized ritual purity and careful observance of religious law, believing that such practices would ensure divine favor. Others focused on ethical behavior and social justice, arguing that God was more concerned with how people treated each other than with ceremonial correctness. Still others stressed the importance of wisdom and understanding, suggesting that right knowledge about divine purposes was the key to eternal life. The emergence of different schools of thought about the afterlife created new opportunities for dialogue and debate, but also new sources of division and conflict. The Pharisees and Sadducees disagreed not just about theological questions, but about their practical implications. If there was no resurrection, as the Sadducees claimed, then justice had to be achieved in this world, or not at all. If resurrection was real, as the Pharisees insisted, then ultimate justice could be deferred until the final judgment. These different perspectives led to different approaches to social and political issues. The Sadducees, focusing on this world, were more willing to accommodate Roman rule and maintain the status quo. The Pharisees, with their eyes on the world to come, were more likely to resist oppression and call for radical change. The theological disagreement had practical consequences that affected how people lived their daily lives. The period between the Old and New Testaments thus represents a time of tremendous creativity and ferment in thinking about death and afterlife. The simple certainties of Sheol gave way to complex visions of judgment and resurrection, of paradise and punishment, of souls sorted according to their deeds and their faithfulness. Yet the older wisdom remained alive as well, offering its own insights into the mystery of mortality and the meaning of human existence. As we drift through these ancient understandings, we begin to sense the profound transformation that was taking place in human consciousness itself. The acceptance of death as natural and inevitable was giving way to the conviction that death was an enemy to be conquered, a temporary interruption in the divine plan for human flourishing. This shift would have enormous implications for how people understood not just death, but life itself, not just individual destiny, but cosmic purpose. The stage was being set for even more radical transformation, for new revelations about the nature of death and the possibility of life beyond the grave. The dead of this transitional period found themselves at the center of a theological revolution they could not have anticipated. In their shadowy realm, whether it was the ancient Sheol or some newer configuration of posthumous existence, they waited as the living above them wrestled with questions that would reshape faith itself. Somewhere in that quiet place between worlds, perhaps the patriarch Abraham stirred slightly, sensing that the promise made to him so long ago was about to be fulfilled in ways he had never imagined. Perhaps the prophet Daniel, his earthly visions now replaced by eternal sight, smiled as he recognized the truth behind his own cryptic words about those who sleep in the dust awakening to everlasting life. And perhaps, in the deepest places of that realm beyond death, something else was stirring too. Something that would soon transform not just how humanity understood the afterlife, but death itself. The greatest revolution in the history of human consciousness was approaching, and it would begin not with the living, but with the dead. But that story, that ultimate transformation of everything humanity thought it knew about mortality and meaning, was still to come. For now, we rest here in this time of preparation, this era of questioning and hoping, this moment when the old certainties were cracking open to make room for something unprecedented in human experience. The ancient world was holding its breath, though it didn't know it yet. The dead were waiting, though they couldn't have imagined what they were waiting for. And in the realm of the living, teachers and students, priests and prophets, the faithful and the doubting, all continued their debates and their prayers, their hopes and their fears, unknowing that the answer to every question about death and life was about to walk among them in human flesh. The silence of expectation hung over the ancient world like morning mist over the Jordan River, though no one yet understood what they were waiting for. In the great cities of the Mediterranean, in the dusty villages of Palestine, in the synagogues of the diaspora, questions multiplied like stars in the desert sky. What happened when breath ceased? Where did the soul journey when the body returned to dust? And if the dead could somehow return, what would that mean for everything humanity thought it understood about life itself? Picture, if you will, a young scribe named Matthias working by oil lamp in Alexandria, carefully copying the sacred texts while merchants from across the known world haggled in the streets below. His fingers traced the ancient Hebrew letters, but his mind wrestled with their meaning. The old scrolls spoke of Sheol with such certainty, describing it as the common destination for all humanity, the quiet realm where king and beggar lay down together in democratic silence. But the newer texts, the ones that made his hands tremble as he copied them, whispered of something else entirely. They spoke of resurrection, of judgment, of the dead awakening to face an accounting for their earthly deeds. Daniel's prophecy haunted his dreams. Isaiah's promise that death would be swallowed up forever echoed in his prayers. And the stories filtering in from the communities of the faithful, tales of martyrs who chose death rather than apostasy because they believed in a life beyond life, left him wondering if everything was about to change. Matthias wasn't alone in his questions. Across the Jewish world, in study houses and marketplaces, at wedding feasts and funeral gatherings, people found themselves caught between the comfort of ancient certainties and the terror and wonder of emerging possibilities. The grandmother's stories about peaceful rest in Sheol, competed with the rabbis' teachings about resurrection and judgment. Old men who had lived their entire lives expecting nothing beyond the grave suddenly found themselves wondering if they might see their deceased wives again. Young mothers who had buried children in the sure knowledge that death was final began to whisper prayers for reunion in some unimaginable tomorrow. The theological landscape was shifting like sand dunes in a desert wind, creating new valleys of hope and new mountains of anxiety. In the temple courts in Jerusalem, the Pharisees and Sadducees conducted their learned debates about the nature of the afterlife, but their arguments echoed far beyond the marble columns and golden ornaments. Every baker and fisherman, every weaver and shepherd had to grapple with the implications of these competing visions. If the dead truly slept in peaceful silence as the ancients taught, then grief could be softened by the knowledge that suffering had ended, that the departed rested free from the struggles and sorrows of mortal existence. But if resurrection awaited, if some great awakening was coming, then death became not an ending, but an intermission, not a conclusion, but a pause between acts in some cosmic drama whose final scene remained unwritten. The Book of Job, that ancient meditation on suffering and faith, took on new meanings in this theological twilight. When Job declared that his Redeemer lived and that he would see God with his own eyes even after his skin was destroyed, earlier generations had understood this as poetic metaphor, as the soul's trust in divine justice that transcended physical death. But now, as new ideas about resurrection spread through Jewish communities, these words began to sound less like poetry and more like prophecy. Consider the profound psychological shift this represented. For centuries, the people of Israel had found meaning in their collective identity, in being part of God's chosen nation that would endure even as individuals passed away. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob lived on not through personal resurrection, but through their descendants, through the continuation of the covenant community that bore their names and carried forward their faith. But resurrection theology introduced a radically different perspective. If the dead could return, if individual consciousness could survive the dissolution of the body, then personal identity mattered in ways that transcended tribal belonging. Each soul became not just a temporary participant in the ongoing story of the people, but a permanent character in an eternal drama where individual choices carried consequences that stretched beyond the grave. This shift created new forms of religious anxiety that would have been foreign to earlier generations. The psalmist who wrote that, "In death there is no remembrance of you, in Sheol who will give you praise," had found comfort in the idea that earthly struggles ended with earthly life. But if consciousness continued after death, if the soul faced judgment and potential punishment, then mortality became not a release, but a transition to even greater uncertainty. The emergence of detailed descriptions of posthumous judgment during this period reflects this new anxiety. The Book of 1 Enoch, though not included in the biblical canon, painted vivid pictures of separate realms for the righteous and wicked dead. The author described a cosmic geography where souls were sorted according to their deeds, where the faithful enjoyed light and comfort, while the wicked endured darkness and torment. These weren't merely theological speculations. They were attempts to map the unmappable, to provide concrete details about mysteries that by their very nature transcended human understanding. The human mind, confronted with the possibility of continued existence after death, demanded to know what that existence would be like. If the soul survived, where did it go? What did it experience? How was it judged? What determined its fate? The answers varied dramatically between different communities and teachers. Some described immediate judgment at the moment of death, with souls instantly transported to their eternal destinations. Others spoke of a waiting period, a temporary state where the dead remained until some future day of universal resurrection and final judgment. Still others developed complex scenarios involving multiple stages of posthumous existence, elaborate journeys through various spiritual realms before reaching ultimate destinations. The influence of surrounding cultures on these developing beliefs cannot be underestimated. The Persian concept of cosmic dualism, with its eternal struggle between forces of light and darkness, provided new vocabulary for describing the ultimate fate of human souls. The Greek philosophical traditions, with their discussions of the soul's immortality and its relationship to eternal truth, offered different ways of understanding personal survival after death. Egyptian religious traditions, encountered by Jewish communities throughout the diaspora, contributed their own imagery and concepts. The elaborate afterlife mythologies of the pharaohs, with their detailed maps of the underworld and their emphasis on proper preparation for posthumous judgment, influenced how some Jewish thinkers began to envision the soul's journey after death. Yet these foreign influences were not simply adopted wholesale. Jewish teachers carefully filtered and adapted outside ideas to fit within their own theological framework. The Persian emphasis on cosmic dualism was tempered by Jewish monotheism. Greek philosophical concepts were modified to accommodate biblical understandings of human nature. Egyptian afterlife imagery was reinterpreted to reflect Jewish beliefs about divine justice and mercy. The result was a rich synthesis that honored both ancient Jewish wisdom and contemporary insights from the broader Mediterranean world. Different communities found different ways of balancing these influences, creating local traditions that reflected their particular circumstances and needs, while remaining recognizably Jewish in their fundamental commitments. The practical implications of these theological developments were profound and far-reaching. If individual souls face judgment after death, then every action, every word, every thought took on eternal significance. The casual acceptance of moral ambiguity that had characterized some aspects of earlier biblical wisdom gave way to intense concern about spiritual preparation and moral purity. New practices emerged to help people navigate these concerns. Elaborate burial rituals developed to ensure proper treatment of the body, which was now understood as potentially important for future resurrection. Prayers for the dead became common, reflecting belief that the living could somehow influence the posthumous fate of those who had passed on. The concept of merit, always present in Jewish thought, but previously focused on communal blessing, became increasingly individualized and connected to personal salvation. The emergence of detailed moral catalogues during this period reflects this new concern with individual accountability. Teachers began compiling lists of virtues and vices, good deeds and sins, righteous behaviors and forbidden actions. These weren't merely ethical guidelines for communal harmony, but survival manuals for souls preparing to face divine judgment. Yet this increased focus on individual moral performance also created new spiritual dangers. The comfortable assurance that all souls shared the same quiet fate in Sheol gave way to competitive anxiety about who would prove worthy of resurrection and reward. The democracy of death was replaced by a meritocracy of the afterlife, where eternal destinies depended on the accumulation of righteous deeds and the avoidance of sin. Some teachers recognized these dangers and attempted to address them by emphasizing divine mercy alongside divine justice. They spoke of God's willingness to forgive sincere repentance, of the possibility that divine love could overcome human failure, of hope that extended beyond human deserving. These teachings provided necessary comfort to those overwhelmed by the apparent impossibility of earning their way into paradise through perfect moral performance. The Book of Psalms, with its honest portrayal of human weakness and divine compassion, took on new relevance in this context. The psalmist's cries for mercy, for forgiveness, for divine help in the face of overwhelming moral demands, spoke directly to the anxieties created by emerging beliefs about posthumous judgment. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, who could stand? became not just a poetic expression of humility, but a desperate question about eternal survival. The development of different schools of thought about the afterlife during this period created new opportunities for theological dialogue, but also new sources of community division. The Pharisees, with their elaborate theories about resurrection and judgment, appealed to those seeking hope for ultimate justice and vindication. The Sadducees, with their insistence on the older biblical understanding of death as final, offered stability and continuity to those uncomfortable with theological innovation. The Essenes, living their ascetic life in the wilderness, developed their own unique synthesis that combined Jewish apocalyptic expectations with Greek philosophical concepts about the soul's nature and destiny. Their writings describe the righteous dead as enjoying immediate translation to a realm of light and peace, while the wicked face immediate punishment in a place of darkness and torment. These different perspectives weren't merely academic differences. They had practical implications for how communities organized their religious life, how they understood their relationship to political authority, how they prepared their members for death and mourning. A Sadducee funeral, with its focus on honoring the deceased's memory and comforting the living, looked quite different from a Pharisee funeral, with its emphasis on the soul's continuation and future resurrection. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals the complexity of these competing beliefs. Jewish tombs often combine traditional symbols with new imagery reflecting beliefs about resurrection and judgment. Inscriptions blend ancient formulas about being gathered to one's people with newer expressions of hope for future awakening. Burial practices reflect both continuity with ancestral customs and adaptation to new theological understandings. One particularly striking example comes from the Jewish cemetery at Beth She'arim, where elaborate tomb decorations combine traditional Jewish symbols with imagery drawn from Greek and Roman art. The artists were clearly attempting to express Jewish beliefs about death and resurrection using visual vocabulary that would be familiar to their cosmopolitan community, creating a unique fusion that honored both their ancestral faith and their contemporary cultural context. The influence of these developing ideas began to extend beyond Jewish communities into the broader Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman writers encountered Jewish perspectives on resurrection and judgment, sometimes adopting or adapting them for their own philosophical and religious purposes. The idea of individual accountability after death, while not entirely foreign to classical thought, took on new dimensions through contact with Jewish theology. Meanwhile, Jewish communities throughout the diaspora continued to encounter local beliefs and practices that influenced their own understanding of death and afterlife. In some regions, this led to creative syntheses that attempted to honor both Jewish faith commitments and local cultural expectations. In others, it produced defensive reactions that emphasized the distinctiveness of Jewish beliefs over against foreign influences. The rabbinic literature that began to emerge during this period reflects these tensions and adaptations. Early discussions in the Mishnah and Talmud show awareness of diverse viewpoints about the afterlife alongside careful attention to the practical implications of different beliefs. The rabbis weren't content simply to collect various opinions. They sought to understand how these beliefs should shape community life and individual behavior. One of the most significant developments was the emergence of detailed discussions about the nature of the resurrection body. If the dead were to be raised, what kind of existence would they enjoy? Would they possess physical bodies identical to their mortal forms? Or would they be transformed into something altogether different? Would they experience physical pleasures and pains? Or would their existence be purely spiritual? The rabbis' answers to these questions were characteristically nuanced and complex. They spoke of the resurrection body as both continuous with and transformed from the earthly body, recognizable enough to preserve personal identity, but different enough to exist in the perfected world to come. They debated whether social relationships would continue in the resurrection, whether there would be marriage and procreation, whether the hierarchies and distinctions of this world would persist in the next. These discussions reveal a deep concern with preserving both the value of earthly existence and the hope of something greater beyond it. The resurrection wasn't understood as an escape from physical reality, but as its ultimate fulfillment and transformation. The body wasn't a prison for the soul, but an integral part of human identity that would be restored and perfected in the world to come. This positive view of embodied existence distinguished Jewish thought from much Greek philosophy, which tended to see the body as a temporary and inferior vessel for the immortal soul. For Jewish thinkers, humans were unified beings, body and soul together, created in the image of God, and destined for resurrection as complete persons rather than disembodied spirits. The implications of this understanding extended into every area of life and death. If the body was destined for resurrection, then caring for physical health became a religious duty, rather than mere practical concern. If earthly relationships would be transformed rather than abolished in the world to come, then building loving connections in this life took on eternal significance. If the material world was to be redeemed rather than abandoned, then working for justice and peace in the present became preparation for the future. These ideas began to reshape Jewish practice in subtle but important ways. Burial customs evolved to reflect beliefs about the resurrection body, with increased attention to preserving the corpse intact for future restoration. Mourning rituals developed that balanced grief for present loss with hope for future reunion. Prayers emerged that asked for divine mercy on behalf of the dead, while expressing confidence in their eventual vindication. The influence of these developments can be seen in the Jewish liturgy that was taking shape during this period. Ancient prayers that had focused primarily on God's faithfulness in this world began to include references to resurrection and the world to come. Traditional blessings were supplemented with new petitions that looked forward to the Messianic age and the final judgment. Yet even as these new elements entered Jewish worship, the older themes remained strong and vital. The Psalms continued to be central to Jewish prayer, with their focus on God's presence in present circumstances rather than rewards in some future existence. The wisdom literature continued to be studied and quoted, with its emphasis on the natural consequences of moral choices rather than supernatural intervention. The tension between old and new proved creative rather than destructive, producing a rich synthesis that honored both ancient wisdom and emerging hope. Different communities found different ways of balancing these perspectives, creating local traditions that reflected their particular circumstances while remaining recognizably Jewish in their fundamental orientation. The diversity of belief during this period created space for different temperaments and life situations. Those facing persecution could find comfort in promises of vindication beyond the grave. Those enjoying prosperity could focus on gratitude for present blessings. Those struggling with loss could choose between hope for reunion and acceptance of separation, depending on which offered greater solace in their particular circumstances. This theological flexibility wasn't mere relativism or indifference to truth. It reflected a mature understanding that the mystery of death was too vast and complex for any single human perspective to capture completely. Different aspects of divine truth might be glimpsed from different angles. Different metaphors might illuminate different facets of eternal reality. Different communities might need different emphases to sustain their faith through different challenges. The emergence of messianic expectations during this period added yet another layer of complexity to beliefs about death and afterlife. If a Messiah was coming to establish God's kingdom on earth, what would happen to those who died before that glorious day arrived? Would they miss the fulfillment of all their hopes and prayers? Would they remain in whatever posthumous state awaited them while others enjoyed the messianic age? Different teachers developed different scenarios to address these concerns. Some spoke of a general resurrection that would coincide with the Messiah's arrival, allowing all the faithful dead to participate in the kingdom they had hoped for but never seen. Others described intermediate states where souls would wait in comfort or discomfort until the final fulfillment of divine purposes. Still others suggested that the messianic age itself would be temporary, followed by an even greater transformation that would affect both the living and the dead. These speculations reveal the deep human need for narrative coherence, for stories that make sense of both individual mortality and cosmic purpose. If God had plans for history, if there was meaning in the long arc of human experience, then individual deaths had to fit somehow into that larger story. The afterlife became not just a personal destination, but part of a grand drama that would eventually culminate in divine victory over all the forces that oppose justice and peace. The Book of Daniel, with its visions of kingdoms rising and falling, its prophecies of final judgment and eternal reward, provided a template for this kind of cosmic thinking. The individual's fate was inseparable from the destiny of the people. The resurrection of the dead was connected to the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. The end of history was also the beginning of something utterly unprecedented in human experience. This connection between personal and cosmic eschatology would prove enormously influential in later Jewish and Christian thought. It meant that death was not just about individual souls facing divine judgment, but about the entire creation moving toward its ultimate fulfillment and transformation. The dead were not just waiting for personal vindication, but participating somehow in the great work of universal redemption. Yet even as these grand visions flourished in the writings of seers and prophets, the practical questions remained urgent and immediate. What should the living do to prepare for death and judgment? How should communities care for the dying and remember the dead? What rituals and practices best honored both the mystery of mortality and the hope of resurrection? What words could comfort those who grieved while acknowledging the uncertainty that surrounded all speculation about the world beyond? Different groups developed different answers to these questions, creating a rich tapestry of practice and belief that reflected the theological diversity of the period. Some emphasized ritual purity and careful observance of religious law, believing that such practices would demonstrate the devotion necessary to earn divine favor. Others focused on ethical behavior and social justice, arguing that God was more concerned with how people treated each other than with ceremonial correctness. Still others stressed the importance of wisdom and understanding, suggesting that right knowledge about divine purposes was the key to eternal life. The proliferation of apocalyptic literature during this period, with its detailed revelations about the structure of the cosmos and the plan of history, reflects this emphasis on knowledge as a form of salvation. The practical consequences of these different approaches were significant. Communities that emphasized ritual observance developed elaborate systems of religious law designed to govern every aspect of daily life. Those that focused on ethical behavior created strong traditions of social justice and care for the vulnerable. Groups that prized revealed knowledge produced libraries of mystical and apocalyptic literature that attempted to map the geography of eternity. Yet despite these differences, certain common themes emerged across the spectrum of Jewish thought during this period. The conviction that individual actions mattered, that moral choices had consequences extending beyond the grave, that divine justice would ultimately prevail even if it was delayed, that death was not the final word in human existence. All of these beliefs began to reshape how people understood the meaning and purpose of mortal life. The transformation was profound but gradual, like the slow change of seasons or the imperceptible shift of shadows across a sundial. The old certainties about Sheol didn't disappear overnight, but they began to seem incomplete, insufficient to address the questions that arose from new experiences of suffering and hope. The comfortable democracy of death gave way to more complex visions of individual accountability and cosmic justice. In the quiet places where the dead were believed to dwell, whether in the ancient Sheol or in the newer realms described by visionary writers, something was stirring. The theological revolution occurring in the world of the living was creating ripples that extended even into the realm of the departed. The dead themselves, if they were conscious of these developments, might have sensed that their long rest was about to be disturbed in ways they could never have imagined. And indeed, something unprecedented was approaching. In the scroll-filled libraries of Alexandria, in the synagogues of Jerusalem, in the study houses of Babylon, teachers and students continued their debates about resurrection and judgment, about the nature of the soul and the destiny of the body, about the relationship between this world and the next. But their discussions, however learned and passionate, were about to be overtaken by events that would transform every assumption about death and life. The ancient world was pregnant with expectation. Though it couldn't yet name what it was expecting, the theological foundations were in place, the questions had been articulated, the hopes and fears had been given voice. All that remained was for someone to step forward and demonstrate that death itself, that final enemy of human happiness, was not as final as it appeared. But we're still in the time of preparation, in the era of questions without answers, of hopes without fulfillment, of expectations without realization. The dead continued their patient existence in whatever realm they inhabited, while the living wrestled with mysteries that seemed to grow deeper rather than clearer with each passing generation. Yet in this very wrestling, in this refusal to accept simple answers to complex questions, in this insistence that death must somehow serve larger purposes than mere biological termination, the ancient world was preparing itself for the most revolutionary moment in human history. Everything that came before, all the centuries of development in thinking about mortality and meaning, all the patient accumulation of questions and possibilities, was about to culminate in an event that would split history itself in two. The stage was set, the actors were in place, the audience was waiting with bated breath. All that remained was for the curtain to rise on the final act of the greatest drama ever performed, the story that would transform not just how humanity understood death, but death itself. The silence was about to break. After centuries of whispered questions and careful speculation, after generations of faithful souls wrestling with mysteries that seemed to deepen rather than resolve, something was stirring in the very foundations of existence itself. The ancient world, unknowing, held its breath. In a small village in Galilee, in the reign of Caesar Augustus, when Quirinius was governor of Syria, the moment arrived. Not with thunder or cosmic fanfare, not with the parting of heavens or the trembling of mountains, but with the simple, quiet miracle of birth. A child was born, and with that birth, everything humanity thought it knew about death was about to change forever. But this child would grow, would teach, would heal, would love, and ultimately would face the same fate that awaited every mortal soul since Adam first drew breath. He would die, and in that dying, he would demonstrate something that no prophet had dared to proclaim, no sage had imagined possible, no theologian had included in their careful maps of the afterlife. Death was not permanent. The gospel writers, when they came to record these events, struggled with language itself. How do you describe the indescribable? How do you capture in human words an event that transcended every category of human experience? They reached for the vocabulary that had been developing for centuries, the theological framework that had been slowly taking shape through all those debates between Pharisees and Sadducees, all those visions of resurrection and judgment, but even their most careful words could only approximate what had occurred. The tomb was empty, the stone was rolled away, the burial cloths lay folded and abandoned. And he who had been dead was alive again, not as a spirit, not as a ghost, not as some ethereal echo of his former self, but as a complete person, body and soul reunited, mortality transformed into something altogether new. This was not the resurrection that the theologians had debated. This was not the general awakening that would occur at the end of days. This was something immediate, particular, personal. One man had crossed the boundary between life and death and returned, not as a visitor from some distant realm, but as a pioneer, blazing a trail that others might follow. The implications were staggering. If death could be conquered, if the grave could be robbed of its victory, if resurrection was not merely a future hope, but a present reality, then everything changed. The ancient questions about Sheol, about the fate of souls, about judgment and vindication, all of these took on new meaning in light of this unprecedented event. The early Christian communities, as they began to form around this central conviction, found themselves inheriting centuries of Jewish thought about death and afterlife, while simultaneously being called to understand these traditions in completely new ways. The old certainties about Sheol were not discarded, but transformed. The newer ideas about resurrection and judgment were not rejected, but fulfilled in ways their original proponents could never have imagined. Paul, the former Pharisee who became the great apostle to the Gentiles, struggled to articulate this transformation in his letters to the emerging churches. He spoke of death as the last enemy to be destroyed, of resurrection as the first fruits of a cosmic harvest, of believers as already having passed from death to life, even while still inhabiting mortal bodies. His words reveal the profound shift that had occurred in thinking about mortality. Death was no longer the natural and inevitable conclusion to human existence. It had become an intruder, a temporary interruption in the divine plan for human flourishing. The dead were no longer permanently separated from the living, waiting in shadowy silence for some distant day of awakening. They were already experiencing the beginnings of resurrection life, already participating in the victory over death that had been won on their behalf. Yet even Paul acknowledged the mystery that surrounded these new realities. He spoke of seeing through a glass darkly, of knowing in part, of awaiting a fuller revelation that would make clear what remained hidden. The transformation of death had occurred, but its full implications were still being discovered, still being lived out in the experience of communities learning what it meant to live in the light of resurrection. The book of Revelation, that great apocalyptic vision that closes the Christian scriptures, paints the ultimate picture of this transformation. Death itself is cast into a lake of fire, along with Hades, the realm that had housed the dead since the beginning of human memory. A new heaven and new earth appear, and the voice from the throne declares that the former things have passed away, that death shall be no more, neither sorrow, nor crying, nor pain. For the former things have passed away. This was not merely a return to Eden, not simply a restoration of humanity's original state. This was something altogether new, a transformation so complete that death itself would become extinct, a relic of an abandoned age when mortality cast its shadow over human existence. But how could such cosmic claims be squared with the obvious reality that people continued to die? How could the victory over death be proclaimed when graveyards continued to fill, when families continued to grieve, when the statistics of mortality remained unchanged? The early Christian answer was both simple and profound. The transformation had begun, but was not yet complete. Resurrection was both a present reality and a future hope, both an accomplished fact and an ongoing process. For those who died in faith, death had become not an ending, but a transition, not a separation, but a deeper form of communion with the divine. They had fallen asleep in the gentle language the early Christians preferred, and would awaken when the final trumpet sounded, and all the dead were raised in bodies that were both recognizable and transformed, both continuous with their earthly existence and adapted to the eternal realm they were destined to inhabit. This understanding brought both comfort and complexity. On one hand, it offered unprecedented hope to those facing mortality, whether their own or that of loved ones. Death had been defeated in principle, and its defeat would be fully manifest in the resurrection of all who had trusted in the one who had blazed the trail through death and into life beyond. On the other hand, it raised new questions about the intermediate state, about what happened to souls between individual death and the general resurrection, about the relationship between the spiritual and physical aspects of human existence. Different Christian communities developed different answers to these questions, creating theological traditions that would influence thought about death and afterlife for centuries to come. Some emphasized the immediate transition of the faithful dead into the presence of God, seeing death as the moment when the soul was finally freed from the limitations of mortal flesh to enjoy perfect fellowship with the divine. Others stressed the importance of awaiting the resurrection of the body, arguing that humans were not complete without both soul and flesh, reunited in the final transformation. The diversity of Christian thought about death and afterlife that emerged during the first few centuries reflected both the richness of the theological inheritance from Judaism and the revolutionary impact of the resurrection event itself. Different communities, facing different challenges and drawing on different aspects of this complex tradition, developed distinctive approaches to understanding mortality and what lay beyond it. Yet through all this diversity, certain convictions remained constant. Death had been defeated, even if its effects were still experienced. Resurrection was both a historical event and a cosmic promise. The dead in Christ were not lost, but were awaiting the fullness of the salvation that had been won for them. And the ultimate destiny of creation itself was transformation rather than abandonment, renewal rather than replacement. As we draw near the close of our journey through these ancient understandings of death and afterlife, we find ourselves in a world utterly transformed from the one in which we began. The simple certainty of Sheol, that democratic realm where all souls gathered regardless of their earthly station, has given way to complex visions of judgment and resurrection, of paradise and punishment, of death defeated and life eternal. The dead, who once rested in shadowy silence beneath the earth, have been promised awakening, transformation, bodies of glory to replace their mortal flesh. The living, who once faced mortality with resignation if not acceptance, now confront death with hope, seeing in it not the final word, but the last enemy to be destroyed. The revolution that began with whispered questions about divine justice and cosmic purpose has culminated in the proclamation that death itself has been swallowed up in victory. The ancient world's patient accumulation of hopes and fears, possibilities and problems, has been answered not with more theology, but with an event that transcended all theological categories. And yet, even as we celebrate this transformation, we must acknowledge that the mystery remains. Death continues to mark the boundary of human experience. The resurrection, however real and revolutionary, remains largely a matter of faith rather than sight. The dead, however blessed their ultimate destiny, remain separated from the living by a veil that few have crossed and fewer still have described. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the ultimate mysteries of existence require not explanation, but trust, not understanding but faith, not certainty but hope. The biblical story of death and afterlife, from the ancient silence of Sheol to the triumphant proclamation of resurrection, is ultimately a story about learning to live with mystery while refusing to surrender to despair. The dead of biblical times, whether they rest in Sheol or await resurrection, whether they enjoy the presence of God or sleep until the final trumpet, have become part of a story larger than their individual lives, a narrative that stretches from creation to new creation, from the first breath to the last enemy destroyed. And we who still live, who still face the prospect of our own mortality, who still grieve the loss of those we love, find ourselves inheritors of this rich and complex tradition. We carry within us the ancient wisdom of Ecclesiastes and the revolutionary hope of Easter, the quiet acceptance of death as natural, and the bold proclamation that death has been defeated. In the end, perhaps that is enough. To live with hope rather than despair, with trust rather than terror, with the conviction that death is not the final word in human existence, but merely the penultimate chapter in a story whose ending has already been written and whose conclusion is joy rather than sorrow, life rather than death, resurrection rather than decay. The ancient world has given us this gift, this inheritance of hope in the face of mortality. From the shadowy silence of Sheol to the brilliant promise of resurrection, from the democratic rest of the grave to the discriminating justice of judgment, from the acceptance of death as inevitable to its defeat as accomplished fact. We have been given a vision of human destiny that transcends the limitations of mortal existence. And so, as we drift towards sleep in our own time and place, we can rest in the knowledge that we are not alone, that we are part of a story that began long before us and will continue long after us, that death itself has been robbed of its ultimate victory, and that whatever lies beyond the veil of mortality is in the hands of the one who has already walked that path and blazed the trail from death to life. Sleep well, dear listener. The ancient stories have been told. The old questions have been asked and answered. The dead have been remembered and honored. And in the morning, when you wake to face another day of mortal existence, you will do so as inheritor of hopes that have sustained the faithful for millennia, as bearer of promises that transcend the boundaries of life and death, as participant in a story whose ending is already written and whose final word is not death but life, not sorrow but joy, not ending but beginning. The silence falls gently now, soft as snow on ancient tombs, quiet as prayer in empty sanctuaries. The biblical dead rest in their various realms, awaiting whatever transformation awaits them. And we, the living, join our voices to the great chorus of hope that has echoed through the centuries, trusting that death is not the end of the story, but merely the turning of a page, not the final silence, but the pause before the greatest song of all. Rest now. The ancient world sleeps. The biblical stories are complete, and you are held in the same hope that sustained Abraham and Moses, David and Daniel, all those faithful souls who walked before us into the mystery of mortality and found there not despair, but hope, not ending but beginning, not death but life eternal.